All right. Yours truly will be moderating the next panel, so I'll invite Karen, Santosh, and Simon up to the stage. Okay. The topic of this panel is about investing. We have a number of startups here today, and now we have a number of venture capitalists, myself being one. So thank you, Karen, Santosh. Nice to meet you in person. Simon, good to see you. So each of these investors, and I'll sort of give their backgrounds for them so we can jump right into the topics at hand. We have 20 minutes. So each of these investors are not only early stage investors in and around manufacturing and supply chain, but they all have something else in common. I'm not even sure they each realize, but Karen at Exposition Ventures now is a new firm. She came from GE Ventures, so it can give us a little bit of the perspective of being inside a corporate venture arm. Santosh at Dynamo Ventures invests primarily around supply chain, but he and a number of his partners have operated in and around supply chain in the past, so he has that operating perspective as well. And Simon, prior to starting the Venture Lab, where he is now, was at Apple and can give us a perspective of kind of internally incubating things and also working with startups. So, I'll start with Karen and kind of, first of all, tell us a little bit about Exposition, but also for those in the audience that are operating in startups and that may be thinking about taking investment from a corporate venture capital arm, based on what you did in the past with GE, sort of when that works, when that's a good thing, how it plays out best.
Thanks, Dayna. Exposition Ventures is an early stage fund, so seed through B, and we're investing across the industrial value chain, hardware and software. And I was privileged to start the advanced manufacturing and enterprise software team within GE Ventures. And so we did a lot of work in this space and early stage investments in this space. And I think in general, a lot, particularly some of the hardware companies and some of the deep tech companies in this space, it's awesome to have a corporate investor who's a patient investor, who perhaps is not as focused on returns. They're really interested in technology for the most part. GE Ventures cared about returns, but oftentimes it's really more about seeing new technologies. We tried very hard to make sure that those companies got access to our factories and to our facilities to test their technologies, and that is a benefit, quite frankly. Occasionally, there's a NIH, not invented here. Sometimes companies will decide that they're going to do it themselves, and we've been on the wrong side of that from time to time. But I think there are things that you can do when you structure those investments to make sure that that doesn't harm you long term.
Right. Simon, if you could chime in here. I know when you were at Apple, worked with a number of startups and internal projects as well, sort of how you aligned interest, how you made it sort of work on both sides of the equation for the companies involved.
Yeah. And coincidentally, actually, Formlabs was I was an early beta user and tester of Formlabs, so it's interesting to be here. I'd say corporate partners and corporate VCs can certainly bring a lot of horsepower, internal resources, and potentially also investment. I think one thing to keep in mind if you're early stage, not necessarily having the legal prowess or the negotiation clout, is to try to foresee any strategic terms that could arise. I've seen situations where early stage startups get maybe enamored with a potential corporate VC, and then maybe a little bit too late decide to focus or end up focusing on the strategic terms, and that could be to their detriment. So foreseeing that a little bit and trying to preempt that conversation around any potential strategic terms especially if it's not a true arm's length fund. I think that's a...
How did that, and we'll stick with you for just a second before I tee up a question for Santosh, but how did that inform kind of what you're doing now with your new venture studio? And tell us a bit more about it.
Sure. So, I'm an engineer by training, was at Apple for 11 and a half years, joined Aris Composites, of which I think NEA led their Series A. Headed up growth there from Series A to Series C, really engineering-focused growth. And got to see a lot of strategic partnerships and deals, both venture and customer strategic deals. Definitely has influenced how we set up Omni Venture Labs, which is early stage, our current early stage accelerator and fund. And we help with introductions to corporate VCs frequently, and oftentimes help startups kind of preempt that strategic discussion that is usually inevitable with corporate VCs.
Yeah. Santosh, I know you focus a little bit more on supply chain than maybe the other two on the panel, maybe not, maybe you're doing more in that space too. But can you talk about sort of the opportunities that you see in companies that you guys have funded around supply chain versus manufacturing, if there's a difference in capital intensity, if there's a difference in the corporate partners they pursue?
Yeah. So when we think about supply chain, we tend to look at 5 areas, and we follow the natural flow of freight. So if you think about something leaving a manufacturing line, right, in China, making its way ultimately to our front doors, as we've been accustomed to the last several years, we'll break it down in international logistics, surface transportation, warehousing fulfillment, and last mile. And you can kind of identify that these in their own right are different industries, and there might be some overlap of players, but they can also be very different. Their purchasing patterns are very different, their attitudes towards technology are different, and even the human side of this tends to be very different, right? And the prior panel, there's a lot of focus on upskilling, reskilling, the human aspect of what technology brings. And for us, as we think about where manufacturing plugs into where we like to spend the bulk of our time, we're very cognizant of the flow of goods. And ultimately, we break it down into what are the systems, subsystems, processes, attitudes, people we need to ultimately help our portfolio companies identify and navigate in order to get product market fit. Because equally, we're early stage investors, so predominantly pre-seed, seed stage investments. So we kind of come in earliest of the early, if you would.
Yeah. And so, and feel free to continue on this topic too, Santosh, but for the other two, one thing that's unique about both of your firms is you've set these up kind of in the midst of the pandemic, or perhaps post-pandemic. I don't know where you think we are on that spectrum. We'll talk about the industries themselves, but talk about investing in these environments, both around companies as well as just thinking about capital efficiency and taking the external factors into account.
One thing that I've certainly seen that the pandemic has definitely been a tailwind for a lot of the companies that we did in the logistics space. So I was saying to Santosh earlier that I was an early investor in NYSHEX, which is ocean shipping and guaranteeing contracts there. We did that company, I don't know, say we did it like 6 years ago, something like that. And people were like, whoa, ocean shipping, what, they're not thinking about that. When you see, you can't get, the pandemic, everybody wanted to look at visibility. We were early investors in Elementum, supply chain visibility, Resolink was around at that time. Everybody, people were like, why would I spend all that money to put up these systems? I think that Amazon always knew this, that supply chain and logistics can be a competitive advantage.
Yeah.
And other companies weren't really thinking about it, and now they're thinking about it. It took me 2 years to get my damn bike when I ordered one at the beginning of the pandemic. And I watched, a bunch of ships sitting off the coast of, California to the port of LA, and you just can't, there's just so much. It's been a huge tailwind. So that part's been good.
The thing that the pandemic did was it has shown a light on all the things that happen in the background.
Yeah.
And when things are working as they should, the customer and general populations forget that there's this massive system and organization that enables you to receive goods as you've ordered to specification in a timely economic way. And the thing that happened in 2020 is that those systems came under stress and ultimately broke. And that's where we spent several holidays, gatherings, talking about this thing called supply chain, and people know what a container ship is now, right? And who thought, somebody would do a e-brake turn in the Suez Canal? All that has, for like people in this room, like it's put forth what we spend our lives thinking about into the public view. And Dayna, kind of to your question, like the types of things we've seen as investors, right? There's smart people now wanting to solve these hard problems. They're willing to commit their lives to this. You're equally seeing, when you think about capital intensity as well, there are certain advances that have been made and understandings that have been had amongst financial investors, customers, corporate stakeholders that allow you to maybe more efficiently get to product market fit and are ready to scale than perhaps when we founded Dynamo in 2016. Because we showed up and people thought, they gave us a weird look. They're like, are you sure there's a thing here? And we're like, well, we're going to tell you in 3 to 4 years if there's a thing here or not.
It's made the corporate stakeholders more willing to spend, to make those capital investments.
Yeah.
I mean, in the earlier panel, we're talking about, Industry 4.0 has been around for 10, 12 years now, right? And the spending just hasn't really happened. But the groups that had scaled projects performed better. And similarly, in manufacturing and supply chain, it's all cost out, cost out, cost out. But if you forget to, and so they don't want to invest. But now that they've seen that, oh my God, when the system breaks, it's a huge loss.
That's a great point. So that was going to be the other half of my question. Thank you for bringing it up. It has become more topical, certainly for early stage investors, but for startups as well as follow-on financiers down the road, which is a big part. We know it takes a lot of capital, even if these companies can run capital efficiently. But have the buyers of the technology change their behavior because they are, investors in a different way. They enable these companies to scale. Venture is there to help companies take risk until which time they can, get more customer adoption, and then they, raise more capital to get the next tier, whatever it may be. But that requires not only product market fit and all these other things that we talk about, but a different buying cycle sometimes. So either from the Apple perspective, Simon, or from your own experience working with startups, have you seen a change because of the pandemic, before the pandemic, just examples of...
Yeah, I do resonate with this highlighting of risk and how it's been really elevated to prominence. I think some of these supply chain SaaS tools, for example, Factor is one of our portfolio companies, Factor Hardware. Their value prop prior to pandemic was, okay, how many man hours is this going to save in the usual course of business? And we always had at the back of our mind, okay, this could also be massively important in the case of a breakdown to prevent like a line down scenario, because that's really where these companies, big tech, big manufacturing companies, lose millions in case of, one component doesn't arrive at final assembly on time. During COVID, this is exactly what happened over and over and over again, and it really caused a lot of disruption. So definitely the ability to showcase that value prop now has been easier, and the buyers are certainly willing to pay more for that kind of insurance, I think. Curious on the other panelists' perspectives.
Yes, I think that's happening. I think that also companies are starting to rethink their supply chain. That's a much larger topic, but you know, we may be, and we'll see, because you learn these lessons again and again, but we may be in a period of deglobalization right now. And so people are thinking about how do I create more distributed supply chains? And that leads, then you have to rethink your whole approach and your software and your hardware and how all of that works. We just invested in Macrofab, which is cloud-based PCB manufacturing, and they, you know, nobody can get chips during this COVID crisis, but they're killing it. And part of the reason that they're killing it is that they're helping you think about substitution, but they're also providing a real service in helping you nearshore your PCB manufacturing. So that we've seen some is happening during this pandemic.
So many different words like deglobalization that we would have never, I'm guessing you didn't utter that word very often at GE.
You know,
10 years ago.
We didn't, although we were looking at more distributed manufacturing, and I think Jeff Emmett will often say we're a global company, but we're manufacturing locally, right? Because if you go into India and sell trains, you have to make a substantial portion of the train there, right?
Yeah, I think localization is a good description.
Yeah.
That's sort of what you nailed. Santosh, when you look at companies starting in these times, and you think about your own investment criteria, you know, Karen just gave a great example of PCB manufacturing and design, and you know, nearshoring, finding different sources. Do you think that there's opportunity for companies to be in these spaces sort of less capital intensive, kind of the way we've thought about tech startups in the past, kind of scaling and getting revenue as you grow? Is that an investment criteria of yours?
We certainly value capital efficiency, and there are certain business models and approaches that are more conducive. Now, I'll be the first one to tell you that there's a physicality to what we all do here, right? And you can only have so much capital efficiency when you're talking about like moving physical items, managing physical items, creating physical items. And that's where you see a subset of the venture markets say like, this isn't for us. We are more software oriented. And as we look through our portfolio, there are certain business models that might be technology enabled, services, maybe even pure SaaS that tend to be more capital efficient. But equally, there's a subset when we think about visibility, robotics, autonomy. We walk into it understanding that there is simply a different capital requirement to meet the bar that a large customer or a series of customers where you get the capital flywheel going, and that's okay, right? The risk reward profile is different. There's going to be more capital at play, but that's our job to use our domain expertise and our deep networks to validate or disvalidate that approach before making the investment. The burden's on us. I definitely do think, like as years have gone on, there is in general a greater capital efficiency that's come to the sector. There were talks about kind of, are there clouds on the horizon macro environment wise? That is going to add a stress, and stress generally creates resourcefulness, is what we've learned from our morning segment. And we've seen that. Like, it's not all kind of sunshine in our portfolio, right? We have founders who are going through some hard spots, but when they emerge, they come out a lot better for it, and their businesses demonstrate that as well. So it's a yes or no. It's probably mixed bag.
Okay. We have just a few minutes left, but I'll throw this out to any of you, and you can all answer if we have time. We have corporates in the audience. We have, VPs of manufacturing. We also have startups. You guys are sort of the advocates for startups, as you've kind of described, helping them. What would be your one advice or request even from some of the corporate buyers of how to embrace technology so that it aligns more with the startup dev cycles?
I'll have a go at it. The thing we've observed from corporates in our network who are constructive with startups versus those who are less constructive, and this means like winning on both sides, right, is the incentives inside your organization. And where those incentives are distributed and line of business is incentivized to engage, interact, try. They don't necessarily always have to succeed, but they can learn from those mistakes when they try. That's where you see kind of that reputation and that ability to innovate start to perpetuate itself. You build the culture.
I agree with that. I mean, I think you got to have a good champion, and I think you've also, for corporates, have to realize that startups are startups. They don't have the same legal teams. You just got to be more efficient and faster in your processes.
Yeah, less burden of contracts. I agree. Try to encourage championship and piloting of the product before, as much as possible, before burdening with legal teams.
Yes, legal, procurement, all of these things, kind of going faster. But also understanding the risk of adopting new technology. But I think that'll be the major unlock: distributed decision making, distributed buying power. Certainly getting to a necessary point before you scale, but it'll enable so much more kind of getting out in the innovation cycle. Well, thank you. This was a quick panel. I'm sure there's tons of other questions from audience members, et cetera, but hopefully we hit on the high points. And now we will introduce our next panel. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks.